some years ago now, and before the time I consulted the first Nadi leaves that I've talked about so much in my book, I went to India with a group of friends, and we went to the Arundhati Guha Caves. Now, these are near Rishikesh. Now, there's another more well-known set of caves nearby called the Vashistha Caves. They were closed at the time, which was kind of a blessing in disguise, because it meant that we could go to these other caves that were kind of hidden away, because we had to walk along the banks of the Ganges, or close to the Ganges, and then round some kind of, we were in kind of barefoot, some of us, so we were walking on difficult stony paths round to this sort of little cave that was set kind of really in the middle of nowhere on a curve of the river. Now, it's not all set up with shrines and things like that, like so many of the old famous caves of India where holy men lived, but this one is really tucked away, so you get a sense of what it is really like to have sat there as one of these holy people that had used those caves over the many centuries. In fact, they say that the first holy men sat there 7,000 years ago. And some very famous yogis and holy men sat in those caves to attain enlightenment. I'm going to tell you about one of the most interesting ones later, but they're all interesting. But let me just explain the amazing sense, because when you go to India, you can go to India and sightsee, and you can come back an unchanged person, exactly the same as the person that went out. Or you can go to India on a pilgrimage, and the person that comes back is not the same person that sets out. It really is the case if you open your heart to India. And when you come to these places, because I'm very interested in things like psychometry with my mediumistic work, which I hold and tune into an object, but you can equally completely open yourself and tune into the vibrations of a place. And these holy places of India have so saturated in spiritual energy that they can be absolutely life transforming. And this one I found particularly special because it was just a natural, ordinary, small little cave. Really didn't seem of any consequence, but the power of that place was quite amazing and remarkable. It was just an astonishing feeling. The sound of the silent area with the sound of just the water of the Ganges gurgling by. No road noises there either. It was a really beautiful place of great tranquility, and I can imagine how one could easily fall deep into the states of higher consciousness and samadhi there. Well, there's been a number of interesting residents there. This is supposed to be the place where some of the Sapta Rishis meditated, and they were some of the people that wrote the Nadi leaves that I spoke about. So this has been one of the main quests of my spiritual pilgrimages to India, to find out more about these people and to find out about what it was like. Now, from those caves we could hear the other people in the other caves further along the river chanting the I think they were chanting the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, because I recognised some of the lines from it, particularly the first ones. And it was an eerie feeling sat there, as many people have done over 7,000 years to know about this place. Now, this is supposed to be the place where in the last century, for example, Swami Rama Tirtha sat, and also another famous Swami called Papa Ramdas are supposed to have attained enlightenment there. Two big figures in Indian teachings that are well worth looking into, which I'll talk about at another occasion, hopefully. And there was another one there, now I've got to look his name up, I'm looking at a screen. I can never pronounce his name because they're all such long names, these Indian ones. But there was another Swami called Purushottamananda. Okay. These Indian names are so difficult. He was another holy man that lived there, and he used to be able to, for example, people used to visit him for his miracles, because he used to touch water and turn it into what they called nectar, like liquid type of sugar that they would make into sweets, and he could turn water into sugar, That reminds me of someone else, doesn't it, who could turn water into wine. And this is supposed to be the place where Jesus sat and meditated. Now, that sounds absolutely astonishing to most people, that Jesus could have sat in that cave. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Jesus went to India. Now, I expect some people are going to be a little bit offended by some of the things I say here, because, you know, they have preconceived ideas about who Jesus was and so forth. But according to the stories, Jesus actually went to India and sat in those very caves where I was sat that time. And I would feel that certainly from the vibrations of that place, there were some hugely spiritual people that had sat there, and it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest that Jesus had sat there. I felt as much vibration there as I did in places in Jerusalem, for example. Now, Jesus is supposed to have come to India. Some have said to learn, and some have said to teach. Jesus is also believed to have met the teacher of Yogananda, Babaji, Maha Avatar Babaji. Now, some say that Jesus appeared to Babaji and told him to send somebody to the West in the form of Yogananda to teach the true message of what the true Christian message was. And if you read a lot of the works of Yogananda, for example, a lot of his teachings show the similarities between what is taught in the Vedas and what is taught in the Bible. And actually, when you look at it properly, without the prejudice of, without prejudice, you see that they're much the same. The same ideas of the teaching, if you see it with the right eyes, they're exactly the same. And actually with all religions, isn't it? If you look at them with a true clarity, you'll see that they're all saying much the same thing ultimately. So Jesus is supposed to have met Babaji, who Maha Avatar Babaji. This is the 2,000-year-old saint who is supposed to still be alive to this day. And I've spoken to people who say they have met him. So there you go. There is incredible things still going on, and maybe some of these great masters are still there guiding humanity in the background. Now, he didn't take the name Jesus when he was in India. He took the name, well, it's written two ways. Some people write it Issa, and some write it Isha. So whether it's Issa or Isha, I understand it to be, if I'm not a scholar, understand that, but I believe it to be written Isha. Okay, so Isha is a holy man who came from Israel to India in his young years. Now, I'd be very interested from those of you who immediately, I expect, to sort of thought, what's all this? This is against all my Christian teachings. Write some comments. I'd like people to debate this a little bit on here, and I'll try to answer some of them too, if I can add a little bit more to this in the comments of this YouTube. But we're talking about something here that I think is absolutely fascinating. I mean, even if you think about the name Christ and Krishna, very similar names in sound, aren't they? Krishna, Christ, very similar names. I'm not saying Jesus was Krishna, but I do believe that in his young years, now from the age of 13, I think it is, to about 29, we don't actually know anything about Jesus. We hear all these early bits about his early life, carpentry and all the rest of it, and then from 13 to 29 we don't know anything about him. What happened to him? Where did he go? And I don't know about you, but my spiritually formative years were between those ages. That's when I became who I am today, I feel, as a person, and my spiritual whatever you might call it, opening and awakening, understanding, happened in those years. And I think most of us go through a sort of a transformative period in that time, a period of sort of seeking and awakening. So the figure of Jesus, or Isha as he was called there, was said to have appeared in India. Now, one of the interesting things that goes with this is that they believe that the Tibetans were onto this idea early on, because in Tibet, when they find the Dalai Lama, for example, when the Dalai Lama is reborn, the monks will go out, and the great teachers will go out, and by looking at the astrology, and other signs, will find the new birth of the Dalai Lama. Now, one of the questions that arises is, we don't know who, for example, the three kings were who came to the birth of Jesus, do we? We don't. When you look at the history of it, they just three wise men from the east. 3 wise men from the east. How far east? When we go east, where do we come to? We come to India, Tibet, and so on. So 3 wise men came from the east because they had seen in the astrology, and they say about the guiding star in the sky, but could that not have been the guiding stars in the astrology that took them to find the exact spot where this great holy teacher would be born? They knew that the great teacher was coming. And if those holy men had come to Bethlehem, could they not have also come again to help the young Jesus develop his spirituality? I mean, he needed time to develop too. You know, he wasn't an instantly enlightened teacher, was he? I mean, he had to spend time in the wilderness, for example, in order to wrestle with his own inner thoughts and problems. You know, he wrestled with his inner devil, didn't he, in order to attain his enlightenment. So he, like all great teachers, the flower had to open. You know, he wasn't born with the flower open; it opened through his life. And I'm sure that time was spent in India. Now, there's records in Tibet that suggest this is the case, and there's records in India, in northern India, and there's also records in southern India, and there's hints of it also in the Nadi oracles too, that, you know, Jesus was indeed a man that had come to India. And just like the Dalai Lama, you know, his birth had been found by 3 wise men who could have been, in this case, would have been Buddhists. Unless it was the Siddhas, you know, because there's the stories there of the Babaji coming to, connecting with Jesus, you know, so maybe that was something from the Himalayas somewhere, you know. We don't know the answer to that, but there seems to be hints of it. Now, I'm not a great scholar, but there's been a lot of fascinating books, and I think there's going to be some upcoming stuff on the TV soon with BBC about this too. And there's been, So the lost years of Jesus have been one of those things that have fascinated a lot of scholars, because once the child reaches a certain age in Buddhism, he's taken from his parents and is educated in the faith of Buddhism. So the question was, did Jesus, you know, spend some of his time away from his parents to be actually educated, in this instance, by Buddhists? Now, the Buddhists, you know, the Buddhists have a very different view of Godhead to what the Christian and Jewish faiths would have had. You know, they don't see God as something separate. They don't actually even really believe in a God in the same sense. There's a lot of conflict between Vedic thought and Buddhist thought about the idea of the soul. They don't believe in a soul, for example. But putting those things aside, there are similarities in the ideas of compassion, of love. When you think about a lot of Jesus's teachings, they are in some ways very similar to Buddha's teachings, and Buddha's teachings were, of course, were taken from Hindu teachings. So it's kind of a progress. The light is sort of bloomed in many different ways through different teachers who have interpreted it in different ways. Now, there are arguments to say that Jesus was actually excommunicated and headed to the Himalayas. Now, this really starts to get into a little bit dodgy ground with some of this, with people's reactions, I expect. But, you know, write some comments. I'll be interested to know, because it was spent that Jesus spent some of the time teaching in many holy cities, including the Benares in India, which is now called Varanasi, another place I went to. Now, all the great holy men of India tend to come to Benares, as it was called, or Varanasi today, at some point. I mean, the Buddha gave his first teachings there in the deer park, for example, by Varanasi. And Jesus too would have, if he'd been to India, would have definitely travelled to Varanasi. And there's records there about him, apparently, and you'd have to read the books about this and read the more scholarly stuff if you want the details. But I'm really whetting your appetite in the hope that, you know, you might look a bit further, because there's some that argue that Jesus was a Buddhist monk. There's others that argue that Jesus was a Indian yogi, and this character Isha comes up time and time again through historic references in India. Now, you know, I mean, we all think, oh, India, he wouldn't have gone there, but when you think about it, the Silk Road was like the main highway in those times. It went right through Israel, right up through India, right on the way to China. And the people would have travelled up and down that road all the time. I remember the very first time I went to India, I opened the there was a paper, I think it was the Hindu Times in English. There was an English written paper, and I was reading about it, and it said, "Oh, big new Roman discovery in southern India." You know, right? What's all this? Then they found Roman coins, Roman armour and all this in southern India. Of course, it was a trading point with the Romans. I mean, we seem to think that India and Europe were completely separate places, but people were travelling to India. There was a major influence upon Greek thought through India. You know, I mean, Aristotle and people were very influenced by teachings that were coming out of India. And even St. Thomas went back to India to take the Christian teachings back to India. And if you look into the Church of St. Thomas, those in many respects, you know, are what sound to me like the original teachings of Jesus that haven't been doctored by the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, that hacked the Bible around and said, we can't have that in it, can't have that in it, chuck that out, chuck that out, that's a bit better, that's what suits Rome better, you know. So the original teachings might still be there in India. So yeah, so there was... they believed he went actually to Kashmir in the end. You know, they went up through Kashmir, and they believe that actually his body is buried in Kashmir. That Jesus finally, when he didn't actually die on the cross. Now here we go again. This is going to cause a lot of problems with Christians, but you know, we read about it a lot in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, and the commercial one that was made out of it, the Leonardo thingy-bob one, that rubbish stuff. But the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail really did look into the idea that Jesus maybe didn't die on the cross and afterwards was resuscitated, and part of his journey went back to India, because there's records to say that Isha returned, which all kind of fits in with the idea of this holy man that the three wise men had come to connect with, finally comes back to India, and he died in India. He died actually in Kashmir, and is allegedly buried in Kashmir, and there's a tomb there in Kashmir to Isha, who is allegedly the tomb of Jesus. Right, so now that probably throws everything on its head for many Christians. You know, Jesus, oh no, he died on the cross, he was resurrected, and he died for our sins and so forth. But I would prefer, if we could, I'd like to think of it, why don't we just take if we look at the real teachings of Jesus, I mean, they are basically about love, which is comparative, that's in all the religions, isn't it? It's about the teaching of love. That's in Buddhism, compassion. It's in Hinduism, prema. It's in Judaism. It's in Islam. It's in all of the religions of the world teach about a God of love, and that's what Jesus was teaching. And Jesus was also teaching about that there's a common language between it, which is just really the language of our heart, to speak from our heart, you know, rather than all this doctrine, and it's not written down in the Bible, then it's a sin, you know, all that nonsense. You know, the nutcases have got hold of the biblical teachings and taken them far, far away from what I think the people intended at the beginning. So why don't we take Jesus down off the cross and look at the teachings that he gives as being more important than the resurrection stuff that I think was added on later in the Bible. I believe he walked on water and did the miracles like the yogi men did, just like that man turned water into sugar. Jesus turned water into wine. I'm quite prepared to accept that there's miracles, but I do think that the teachings have been altered to the point that a Roman audience needed these teachings in their way, so they distorted them. So I think let's open our mind to the idea that there's a possibility that Jesus went to India. There's a lot of good books out there about it. I've written about it in my book in much more detail than I'm talking about here. But yeah, let's have a talk. What do you think? Do you think I'm mad saying this, or do you think there's real evidence? Jane and I now do our spiritual work for our foundation. all the profits that come from things like our conferences and theatres and workshops and all those exciting things now go into this foundation, which ultimately has the long-term plan of building centres in the UK and maybe around the world one day. But meanwhile, we've been doing a lot of direct spiritual work with it. We've been going out, feeding people in India, giving to the destitute, giving to beggars. We've helped feed schools, helped orphanages, and we've even given cows to older people that have no other form of income. So mediumship can change your life, but it can also help people directly in the world. So go to the links at the end and find out all about what Jane and I are trying to do. And you can do a lot just by sharing these videos on social media. Help us get the word out. Help us to do something really good in this world. Click on this picture of me to subscribe to our channel and see all of our latest videos as soon as they're published. Or click on this next video for more of our stuff.